Mason City, Iowa, June 1995. A town preparing for another summer morning, a newsroom waiting for its anchor, and a young woman who never arrived. Mason City, Iowa, a peaceful river town where mornings come early and life moves with a familiar rhythm. People wake before dawn, coffee brews in quiet kitchens, and the soft hum of routine fills the air. But in the summer of 1995, that rhythm was broken, quietly, suddenly, and without warning. Some stories begin in the quiet hours before sunrise, a time when the world is still, streets are empty, and a single moment can change everything. On June 27, 1995, in a small city in northern Iowa, a young news anchor was preparing for her morning broadcast and vanished before she ever reached the studio. No screams, no eyewitnesses, no clear answers, only a timeline frozen in the hours just before dawn. This is the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. Before that day, before the unanswered questions and the decades of searching, Mason City felt like the kind of place where nothing unexpected could slip through the quiet, a place where neighbors knew one another, where the local news was a comforting presence, and the anchor who greeted viewers each morning seemed to be a part of the community's daily heartbeat. Jodi Huisentruit, just 27 years old, was the face people trusted to start their mornings, energetic, warm, and unmistakably dedicated. She carried the glow of someone who had found her path in life, someone who loved her work, her friends, and the rhythm of early morning broadcasts. But on that June morning, the rhythm faltered. As the clock approached 4 a.m., the KIMT-TV newsroom prepared for its usual routine. Scripts were being checked, lights were warming, and producers were waiting for the familiar sound of a key turning in the studio door. Jodi should have been on her way, driving her small red Mazda through the silent streets. But she wasn't there. Not yet. When the minutes passed and her seat remained empty, concern began to grow. A phone call was made to her apartment, then another. And in those moments, those small, quiet moments before the sun rose, the first signs of a mystery began to unfold, a mystery that would stretch far beyond Mason City, far beyond that morning, and far beyond anything the community could have imagined. What happened in those early hours? How could someone vanish between their front door and their car? How does a life disappear in the space of a single, fragile moment? To understand that morning, we must first understand the woman behind the story, the life she lived, the dreams she pursued, and the world she built for herself leading up to June 27, 1995. And so we begin with Jodi herself. To understand the weight of the mystery, we return to where Jodi's story truly began, far from the silence of that June morning, far from the unanswered questions that still linger. We return to Long Prairie, Minnesota, a small Midwestern town surrounded by lakes, fields, and the kind of quiet that shapes childhood memories. Jodi Sue Huisentruit was born on June 5, 1968, and from the earliest years of her life, people around her remember a spirit that was bright, energetic, and endlessly determined. She grew up in a close-knit family, with strong ties to her mother and her sisters, bonds that would carry her through every chapter of her life. Those who knew her then often described her as cheerful, outgoing, and always in motion, a young girl with big dreams and an even bigger work ethic. In school, she was the kind of student who didn't just show up. She engaged, she tried, she pushed forward with a sense of focus that suggested she already sensed the path she'd eventually walk. Teachers remembered her as someone who cared deeply about learning, but also about people, someone who smiled easily, who made friends quickly, and who seemed to understand how important human connection really was. As she grew older, her interest in storytelling began to take shape. She participated in activities that developed her confidence: speech, journalism, anything that allowed her to use her voice. Her dream of becoming a journalist wasn't something that appeared suddenly. It was something she built slowly, piece by piece, with a sense of passion that never faded. After graduating from high school, Jodi attended St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, a school well known for its mass communications program. There, she immersed herself in broadcasting, learning not only the technical skills behind the camera, but the discipline and preparation required to be in front of it. She studied early mornings, late nights, and every element of the craft: writing, reporting, editing, producing. Friends from those years remembered her as someone who approached her future with optimism and hard work, someone who didn't shy away from long hours or difficult assignments. Jodi carried a spark, a sense of enthusiasm that made her memorable. She wasn't just learning journalism, she was absorbing it, shaping it, and preparing for the world she hoped to enter. After college, she worked at several stations across the Midwest, building her resume, sharpening her on-air presence, and gaining the experience she needed. Each new step brought her closer to the spotlight she had always envisioned. Eventually, her journey led her to Mason City, Iowa, a station called KIMT-TV, where she was offered the role of morning news anchor. It was a demanding position, one that required a strict schedule, strict discipline, and an early morning stamina that few people could maintain. But Jodi embraced it, she chose it, and she thrived in it. By 1995, she had become a familiar face across northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. Viewers woke up with her voice, her smile, and her energy. She brought warmth into living rooms before the sun had risen, guiding her audience through the headlines of the day. She was dedicated, prepared, and always professional. Co-workers later described her as upbeat, hard-working, and well-liked. She had an easy charm, the kind of presence that made a newsroom feel lighter. Off-camera, she was known for the same qualities: a positive attitude, a playful sense of humor, and a genuine care for the people around her. She enjoyed spending time with friends, attending community events, and participating in local activities. Her life wasn't just about the news, it was about connection, laughter, and being part of the world she reported on. Outside the studio, Jodi lived an active lifestyle, filled with the things she loved: water skiing on the lakes, jogging, playing golf, and enjoying the outdoors. She competed in water skiing tournaments, often placing well, sometimes even winning. It was a sport she adored, a release from the pressures of daily deadlines and early mornings. She also participated in charity events, volunteered, and stayed involved with her community. Mason City wasn't just where she worked, it had become part of her life, a place she felt at home. But behind the brightness she showed on screen, there were also pressures, routines, and the quiet strains that come with public life. Being a morning anchor meant adjusting her entire world around a schedule that most people never experience. Waking before dawn, preparing stories late at night, organizing the next day's broadcast, and trying to maintain a balance between personal time and professional demands. Friends later mentioned that there were days when the schedule weighed heavily on her, days when the exhaustion of early mornings set in. But despite the fatigue, despite the demands, she remained committed, always arriving prepared, always ready to deliver the news with the polished confidence viewers expected. In her personal life, she stayed closely connected to her family. She called home often, visited when she could, and kept her relationships strong. Her mother and sisters were an anchor in her life, offering support, encouragement, and comfort. Those bonds only grew more meaningful as her career advanced. By the summer of 1995, Jodi was well established, respected, and admired. She was living the life she had dreamed of since childhood: a career in journalism, a place in a community that welcomed her, and a future that seemed full of possibility. No one who saw her that summer, at the water, at the golf course, on the news, or at home, could have imagined how quickly everything would change. How a life so full of motion could be halted in a single moment. How a routine so predictable could be disrupted without warning. How someone so visible, so present, could disappear before sunrise, leaving behind only questions. Before the mystery begins, before the timeline of June 27th unfolds, we hold on to the image of who she was: a daughter, a sister, a friend, an athlete, and a journalist. A woman whose life was defined by energy and ambition, not by the uncertainty that would soon follow. And now, with this understanding of her world, her past, her dreams, and the life she built with determination, we step into the final 24 hours before everything changed. In the final 24 hours before Jodi Huisentruit vanished, nothing appeared out of place. Nothing suggested the day would become one of the most examined timelines in Iowa's history. It began like many summer days in her life, busy, social, active, and filled with the things she loved. But when investigators later retraced her steps, every minute of June 26, 1995 became essential. Every movement, every interaction, every detail frozen in time. The day started warm and bright. Jodi had plans, commitments, and the familiar energy that drove her through even the longest days. She enjoyed the heat of a summer afternoon, the kind of weather perfect for being on the lake, a place she felt most at ease. That Monday, she went water skiing with friends on Clear Lake, only a short drive from her home in Mason City. Water skiing wasn't just a hobby for her. It was a passion, a release, an escape from early alarm clocks and newsroom deadlines. Friends later recalled that she seemed happy, relaxed, comfortable in her surroundings. There was laughter, there were conversations, and nothing about her behavior suggested worry or concern. She was simply enjoying the start of another week. After finishing on the water, she attended a local Chamber of Commerce golf tournament. Jodi didn't golf much that day, but she participated in the social part of the event. She mingled, talked with friends, and spent time with people she knew well. It was the kind of community event she often took part in, friendly, open, connected. Those who saw her said she seemed in good spirits, her usual upbeat self, carrying the bright personality that made her memorable. There were no signs of distress, no unusual remarks, no behavior that raised concern. Everything about the day appeared ordinary, familiar, routine. As evening approached, she returned home. Her apartment, located at the Key Apartments complex on North Kentucky Avenue, was only minutes from the KIMT-TV studio. It was a comfortable place, practical for someone with an early morning schedule. She lived alone, kept a tidy space, and maintained a predictable routine. Because she was scheduled to anchor the morning news the next day, June 27th, she had to prepare for her early shift. Morning anchors often start their day around 3 or 4 a.m., reviewing scripts, updating overnight headlines, and getting ready for air. For Jodi, it meant winding down earlier than most people, organizing her clothing, her notes, and her morning routine before trying to get a few hours of sleep. But according to later statements from coworkers, she returned home that evening later than she normally would before an early shift. It wasn't alarmingly late, just later than her usual pre-broadcast routine. Still, nothing about it suggested concern. She had spent time with friends, enjoyed the day, and intended to get some rest before work. What happened at her apartment that night remains part of the mystery. There are no confirmed details about the exact time she went to bed, or how long she slept, or whether anything unusual occurred inside those walls. All anyone knows is that she prepared as she always did, readying herself for another early morning on air. She was expected to arrive at the KIMT-TV studio around 3 a.m. to begin her shift. It was a rhythm she had followed countless times, one she rarely deviated from. When she didn't show up on time, it immediately stood out. At 4 a.m., a producer at the station called her apartment. It wasn't unusual to check in if an anchor was running late, but this call marked the beginning of the timeline investigators would study for decades. There was no answer. Minutes passed. Another call was made.
Still no response. Inside the newsroom, concern grew quickly. Jodi wasn't someone who overslept or missed work without reason. Her punctuality was well known, and her reliability was part of her professional identity. When she didn't return the calls, it triggered a quiet sense of worry, one that became stronger as the minutes continued to pass. Around this time, attempts were made to reach her again. Coworkers later said they assumed she must have overslept. It wasn't typical for her, but it was the only reasonable explanation at that hour. They hoped she would answer, or arrive at the door, or call back with an apology for running behind. But nothing happened. When she remained unreachable, the concern shifted from mild worry to alarm. Someone from the station contacted the Mason City Police Department to request a check on her welfare. It was still early, still quiet outside, still the kind of hour when most of the city was asleep. But for those in the newsroom, the silence surrounding Jodi was becoming unsettling. As police were notified, the sun had not yet risen. The city was still in darkness, that eerie transitional darkness that sits just before dawn. The streets were empty. The parking lots were quiet. The morning's broadcast was approaching, and Jodi's seat remained empty. Within minutes, officers were dispatched to her apartment complex. It was a simple call, a welfare check on a young anchor who hadn't arrived for work. Something that, under normal circumstances, might have resulted in a brief knock on a door, a quick apology, and a rushed drive to the studio. But this morning would not be normal. This morning would not be simple. And this call, made in the early hours of June 27, 1995, would become the starting point of one of Iowa's most enduring mysteries. When police arrived at the Key Apartments, the mystery deepened immediately. Her car was still in the parking lot, the red Mazda Miata she drove every morning to the studio. The vehicle she should have been inside. The vehicle that should have been gone by that hour. This single detail changed everything. In the span of a few minutes, the quiet concern of coworkers evolved into something far more serious. Her car wasn't moving. She wasn't answering. She wasn't at work. And as officers approached the vehicle, they began to notice things that didn't align with a simple case of oversleeping. Items near the car, objects on the ground, signs that something had interrupted her morning routine. Something sudden, something unexpected. The final hours of June 26th had seemed ordinary, but the first hours of June 27th would become the focus of an entire investigation. A day that began with friends, water skiing, and laughter would end with unanswered questions, scattered belongings, and the beginning of a search that has lasted for decades. And so, as the timeline moves forward, as investigators step into the parking lot outside her home, we enter the crucial moments that define the heart of this story, the narrow window in which Jodi Huisentruit disappeared.
When officers arrived at the Key Apartments on North Kentucky Avenue, the sky was still dark, the air still cool, and the city still silent. It was the early morning hour when time feels suspended, when only a few porch lights glow, and the world has not yet begun to move. But in that stillness, something immediately stood out. Jodi's red Mazda Miata was parked in its usual spot, unmoved, untouched, and out of place for the hour. At a time when she should have already been at the studio preparing for her broadcast, her car remained exactly where she had left it the night before. This alone was unusual. But within moments, officers saw details that were far more concerning. Near the car, scattered on the pavement, were several personal items known to belong to Jodi. The exact list, confirmed through public reports, included things she would have carried with her on a normal morning, items she would never purposely leave behind. These scattered belongings created a picture suggesting that something had interrupted her walk from her apartment to her car. Something abrupt, something forceful, something that stopped her before she could begin her day. Her tote bag was found on the ground. Papers from inside it were scattered nearby. A pair of red high heels,
The shoes she often wore while anchoring the morning news were discovered lying beside the car. Her car key was bent, later documented as having been found near the vehicle. All of these items pointed to one thing: a struggle. But the parking lot told its story quietly, without drama, without witnesses. Only the position of the items, the angles, the distances, and the silence filled in the outline of what had occurred. Investigators carefully examined the area. They noted drag marks near the car. They noted the placement of her belongings. They noted the physical signs that something had happened quickly, something disruptive enough to scatter her possessions, but quiet enough that almost no one saw a thing. Later information confirmed that a neighbor reported hearing a scream in the early morning hours. A scream that stood out in an otherwise silent complex. But at the time, that sound had no context. No one connected it to danger. No one linked it to a missing person. And no one knew that the scream might have been the final audible trace of a young woman who would never be seen again. Police also learned that another resident saw a white van in the parking lot around the time of the disappearance. This detail has been widely reported over the years, but it's important to note the presence of the vehicle has never been definitively connected to the case. It was a lead, a detail, a piece of information from a morning filled with uncertainty. Nothing more. As investigators moved through the area, the timeline of Jodi's morning began to tighten. Tighter and tighter, until the entire window of her disappearance narrowed to minutes. Her coworkers had called her shortly after 4 a.m. They continued calling until the decision was made to alert police. Based on everything known, investigators believe she likely woke up late after missing her first call, a call meant to nudge her awake. If she hurried, if she rushed out the door, if she moved quickly through her routine, she may have left her apartment in a hurry. But she never made it to her car. The narrow window between her first missed call and the discovery of her belongings suggested a brief and critical period, possibly only a matter of minutes, in which she vanished. When police attempted to access her apartment, they found no signs of forced entry. Inside, the space appeared organized and normal. Nothing was overturned. Nothing showed evidence of a struggle inside. Her personal items were in place. Her clothes were neatly arranged, and her bathroom showed signs of a typical morning routine. It appeared she had been preparing to leave, but never got far. Outside, investigators documented everything they could. Photographs were taken of the car. Measurements were recorded. Footprints and tire impressions were examined. Neighbors were interviewed. Residents were asked what they might have seen, what they might have heard, what they might have noticed in the dim early morning light. But the truth was unsettling. Most people were asleep. Most blinds were closed. Most of Mason City was unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The hours before sunrise left the apartment complex quiet, with only the faintest possibility that someone might have glimpsed something relevant. In those crucial minutes, Jodi Huisentruit had disappeared. By mid-morning, authorities expanded the search. A perimeter was established. Roadways and fields near the complex were checked. Officers moved through the nearby areas looking for footprints, objects, or signs that someone had moved quickly across the landscape. Search dogs were brought to the scene, attempting to follow any scent that lingered. But the trail was limited, interrupted by time, distance, and the uncertainty of what direction the situation had taken. From the parking lot, investigators attempted to reconstruct the possible sequence of events. They knew when she missed her calls. They knew when the police arrived. They knew where her belongings fell. But they did not know who was in the parking lot with her. They did not know what direction she was moved. They did not know what vehicle, if any, might have been involved. The timeline held firm, but the details within it refused to reveal themselves. What made the scene so chilling was its simplicity. No eyewitnesses watching from windows, no cameras to record the moment, no distinct sound except a single scream, no clear clues pointing to a direction of travel, no trace of where she was taken or why. It was a crime that left almost nothing behind, a disappearance that seemed to occur between two breaths of morning air, a moment so quick, so precise, so quiet, that the world around it barely stirred. And yet, the signs of struggle were unmistakable. The items on the ground, the drag marks, the bent key, the stillness of her car. Together, they formed the outline of an event that changed everything, but revealed almost nothing. By the time the sun rose over Mason City, the parking lot that had begun the day as an ordinary patch of pavement was now the center of one of the most intense investigations the community had ever seen. Officers came and went. Detectives took notes. Neighbors stepped outside, confused and anxious. And the newsroom that had expected Jodi's arrival that morning was now reporting on her disappearance. The timeline was fragile, tightly constructed, and critically important. But even in its clarity, it offered no answers. And as the investigation moved forward, every part of that parking lot, every inch, every footprint, every scattered item became the foundation of a search that would continue for decades. Now, with the scene documented and the timeline established, investigators began the next crucial phase, uncovering what happened to Jodi Huisentruit after she vanished from that quiet parking lot in the early hours before sunrise.
As the morning of June 27, 1995 unfolded, the urgency surrounding Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance intensified. What began as a welfare check had quickly become something far more serious, a rapidly escalating investigation that would draw in local authorities, state agencies, and eventually, federal resources. The Mason City Police Department took immediate control of the scene. Officers secured the parking lot around Jodi's car, marking off boundaries, documenting every item, every marking, every possible trace of movement. Detectives examined the ground carefully, aware that even a footprint or a faint impression could become important later. Once the initial assessment was underway, the Department of Criminal Investigation, the DCI, was contacted. Their arrival signaled the severity of what the local officers were facing. A young anchor missing, a struggle evident, no immediate leads, no clear direction of travel, and no sign of where she had gone. By mid-morning, the FBI had been notified as well, with a potential abduction, unknown motives, and the possibility of interstate movement. Their involvement brought additional expertise, additional resources, and the possibility of broader coordination. This cooperation between the MCPD, the DCI, and the FBI formed the foundation of the investigative efforts that would continue for years. The first step was clear: establish Jodi's last known moments and identify anyone who might have seen or heard something. Detectives began interviewing her coworkers, friends, neighbors, and anyone who had interacted with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. At KIMT-TV, investigators spoke with producers, anchors, and staff members who knew her schedule intimately. They reconstructed her work routine, her habits, and the significance of the missed calls that morning. Her coworkers described her as dependable, energetic, and rarely late, details that reinforced the urgency of the situation. They provided information about her previous day, her activities, and anything she had mentioned in recent conversations. Everyone cooperated, everyone was concerned, and everyone understood the gravity of what was unfolding. At the key apartments, officers canvassed the building. Door after door, knock after knock, they asked residents whether they had heard unusual sounds, noticed unfamiliar vehicles, or seen anything out of place during the early morning hours. Most residents reported nothing. Most had been asleep. Most had not realized anything had occurred until the police knocked. But there were a few important accounts. One neighbor reported hearing a scream sometime around the early morning hours. A sharp,
sudden cry that stood out in the quiet. This detail was documented, noted carefully, and added to the timeline. It could not be confirmed with precision, but it was significant. Another resident recalled seeing a white van in the parking lot that morning. This too was noted, interviewed, recorded, but never officially connected to the disappearance. Throughout the day, search efforts expanded. Officers combed areas around the apartment complex, fields, wooded patches, nearby trails, and water-adjacent locations. Volunteers from the community joined. People brought their own flashlights, walked through parks, checked ditches, and scanned roadsides. The entire region seemed to mobilize, driven by both fear and hope. Fear that something terrible had happened, and hope that Jodi might still be found. Search dogs were brought in to follow any possible scent trail. They moved through the complex, the parking lot, and the surrounding areas. But the results were limited. Whether due to the time delay, weather conditions, or the nature of the event itself, the dogs were unable to provide a definitive direction of travel. At the same time, investigators reviewed phone records. Calls to and from Jodi's apartment, calls from the station, and any activity that might shed light on whether she had contacted anyone late that night or that early morning. But there were no confirmed calls that offered answers, no messages, no unusual activity that pointed toward a specific concern or threat. Her apartment was analyzed thoroughly as well. Detectives documented its layout, photographed its rooms, and examined areas where she prepared for work. Inside, nothing indicated a disturbance. Her clothing choices appeared set out as usual. Her bathroom showed signs of a routine morning. Her living space was orderly. From the inside, there was no indication that the day would be anything other than ordinary. Investigators then expanded their focus outward, interviewing individuals who had seen her the previous day, at the lake, at the golf event, or in her circle of acquaintances. These were routine interviews, standard in any disappearance where every detail of the previous 24 hours becomes important. These individuals were interviewed as sources of information, nothing more. No accusations were made, no conclusions were drawn. They were simply people who had interacted with her in the days or hours before she vanished, and therefore their perspectives mattered. Beyond personal interviews, investigators gathered surveillance footage from nearby businesses, gas stations, and roadways. This was 1995, a time before widespread digital cameras and constant video coverage. Available footage was limited, grainy, and often of poor quality. Still, officers reviewed everything they could access. They looked for her car, for her movements, for any nearby vehicles entering or exiting the area. But no video confirmed what had happened or who might have been in the parking lot that morning. As the day continued, tips began to pour in. People called the station. People called the police. People reported anything that seemed unusual. A vehicle they didn't recognize. A noise they remembered. A person they thought seemed out of place. Every tip was logged. Every tip was examined.
Some were followed up immediately. Others were investigated later, and many were found to have no connection at all. Search teams expanded their work to areas outside the city, rural roads, wooded sections, riverbanks, and properties that might hold information. The terrain around Mason City was broad, open, and difficult to search completely. But the efforts were extensive. Planes flew overhead. Helicopters surveyed open fields. Officers coordinated ground searches with county deputies. Every resource available was put to use. But despite the effort, despite the coordination, despite the urgency, no definitive trace of Jodi was found. As hours turned into days, investigators continued to follow every lead, interview every potential witness, and examine every possibility. They built timelines, cross-referenced information, and revisited the parking lot again and again. Detectives compared statements, clarified details, and analyzed inconsistencies. They checked alibis, verified accounts, and confirmed movements, not as accusations, but as necessary steps in a thorough investigation. By the end of the first week,
It was evident that the investigation was moving into a longer phase, a phase requiring patience, persistence, and continued coordination. Authorities held press conferences, urging the public to come forward with any information, no matter how small. The case was featured on national news segments. Flyers were distributed across the region. Communities posted signs, organized vigils, and offered support to the Huisentruit family. All efforts shared a single goal: find Jodi. But as the investigation broadened, the mystery deepened. A struggle had clearly occurred. A timeline had been established. A search had been launched. And yet the central question remained untouched. What happened after she left her apartment door? This question, unanswered, persistent, and deeply unsettling, would shape the next stages of the investigation, the theories that emerged, and the decades of searching that followed. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit shifted from an active emergency into one of the most perplexing, unsolved cases in the Midwest. Investigators had a timeline. They had a scene. They had interviews, reports, and long hours of analysis. But they did not have the one thing they needed most: clarity. With no confirmed sightings, no conclusive evidence, and no definitive direction of travel, the investigation entered a stage where possibilities had to be examined carefully, responsibly, and without assumptions. And over time, several publicly known theories emerged, each rooted in broad investigative reasoning, but none proven, none confirmed, and none able to answer the questions that still echo decades later. The first theory considered was abduction by an unknown person, a scenario where someone unaffiliated with Jodi's life encountered her in a moment of opportunity. The early morning hours, the quiet parking lot, and the small window of time all aligned with a situation in which a stranger could have approached unnoticed. This theory gained attention because the silence of the scene suggested speed and surprise, elements consistent with a sudden encounter. But without witnesses or evidence pointing toward a specific individual, it remained only a possibility. Another publicly discussed theory was that someone familiar with her routine may have been involved. Jodi maintained a predictable schedule. She left for work at roughly the same time every morning, often before sunrise, when most residents were still asleep. Her early morning departures were not secret, and her daily rhythm was well known to coworkers, friends, and community members. This predictability alone raised questions during the investigation, not as an accusation toward any person, but as a factual observation about her lifestyle. Someone aware of her schedule could have known precisely when she would step outside. But again, no evidence linked this possibility to any identified individual. A third theory revolved around a crime of opportunity. In this scenario, investigators considered whether someone passing through the area, a traveler, a transient individual, or someone with no prior connection to Jodi, encountered her by chance. The proximity of major roads, early morning traffic patterns, and the isolated nature of the parking lot during pre-dawn hours all left room for this line of thought. But like the others, it remained unproven. There were also discussions about the possibility of a stalker scenario, based on concerns Jodi reportedly shared in the months before her disappearance. Public records and news reports indicate that she had mentioned feeling uneasy at times, and that she discussed situations where she felt she was being watched or followed. These statements were taken seriously by investigators, reviewed carefully, and considered alongside other leads. But no confirmed evidence ever established that a stalker was responsible, nor was any individual ever identified through this angle. A final broad theory suggested a targeted attack, a situation in which someone may have approached her with intent, directed specifically at her. This scenario, like the others, lacked proof and lacked a confirmed connection to any person. Investigators considered it only as part of responsible analysis, because any disappearance with signs of struggle must be examined from multiple angles. And yet, despite the theories,
no conclusion could be drawn. Every possibility remained just that, a possibility. No theory rose above the others. No theory could be confirmed, and no theory ever reached the threshold of evidence needed to declare it fact. As the years progressed, the case did not fade. It evolved. It resurfaced. It continued to generate tips, questions, leads, and renewed searches. In 2001, investigators reopened the case files, revisiting earlier information with fresh eyes and updated tools. They reviewed interviews, re-examined physical evidence, and followed new tips that had surfaced. Cold cases often benefit from time, from perspective, from advances in technology, and from the willingness of people to come forward years later with details they once held quietly. But even with renewed effort, the core mystery remained intact. In 2011, on the anniversary of her disappearance, authorities spoke publicly again, a reminder that the case was still active, still open, and still lacking the answers her family deserved. Press statements emphasized that no person had ever been ruled responsible, that the investigation had never officially closed, and that tips continued to be evaluated as they came in. They urged the public to continue bringing information forward, no matter how small or how outdated it might seem. Sometimes, a single overlooked detail can reshape years of uncertainty. Over time, new tips arrived. Some were detailed, some were vague. Some pointed investigators toward possible locations, possible items, or possible individuals. Each one was reviewed, documented, and assessed. Many led nowhere. Some prompted searches. Others were deemed unrelated, but they were never ignored. There were reported sightings of individuals who resembled Jodi, sightings in neighboring states, sightings years after her disappearance, sightings prompted by people who believed they had seen someone familiar in a crowd or a public place. Authorities examined these reports carefully, respectfully, and consistently. But none were ever confirmed. None provided evidence that could move the investigation forward. In 2018, long after the initial investigation, the Mason City Police Department conducted a search of vehicles connected to the case. Public documents reveal that investigators seized several items and examined them with updated forensic techniques. This development, more than 2 decades after the disappearance, signaled that the case was still active, still evolving as technology advanced. But, once again, no definitive conclusions were announced. Throughout all these years, one fact has remained constant. The case is officially unsolved. No charges have been filed. No individual has been formally connected to the disappearance. No single theory has risen to certainty. The investigation continues because it must continue, because unanswered questions demand persistence, and because families deserve closure even when decades have passed. The search for answers has extended beyond law enforcement as well. In 2003, former journalists, community members, and volunteers joined together to create FindJodi.com, a group dedicated to keeping the case in the public eye. Their work includes gathering public documents, interviewing people connected to the story, and maintaining awareness so that time does not erase the urgency of the investigation. They operate independently, without accusation, without speculation, and with a commitment to preserving factual history. Their presence has played an important role in ensuring that Jodi's story is neither forgotten nor overshadowed by the passing years. Even today, the search continues. Tips are still submitted, information is still reviewed, interviews are still conducted when necessary, and the hope, the quiet, persistent hope, remains that someone will come forward with the detail that finally changes everything. Theories exist. Possibilities exist. Leads have come and gone. Searches have expanded and paused,
and expanded again. But the truth, the definitive truth, remains just out of reach. And so, as the investigation moves through time, through decades of effort and uncertainty, the story shifts from theories to impact. The impact on the people who loved Jodi, the community she served, and the legacy that continues in her absence. In the days that followed Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, Mason City found itself transformed. A quiet community, accustomed to early mornings and steady routines, was suddenly confronted with uncertainty, fear, and a collective ache for answers that were nowhere to be found. The impact was immediate and lasting, because when someone so visible, so familiar, and so deeply connected to the community vanishes without explanation, the shock ripples outward, touching every home, every conversation, every morning that begins without resolution. For Jodi's family, the news was devastating. Her mother, her sisters, her loved ones, all were thrown into a storm of emotion that no family is ever prepared to face. They traveled to Mason City as quickly as they could, entering a landscape of search teams, reporters, investigators, and a sea of unanswered questions. The place that had once been part of Jodi's rising career had become the center of a mystery that weighed heavily on their hearts. In those early days, the family's focus was hope. Hope that she might still be found. Hope that someone had seen something. Hope that a detail, a lead, or a piece of information might bring her home. They participated in searches, attended briefings, spoke with investigators, and stood with the community as everyone tried to understand what had happened. But as days turned into weeks and the immediate rush of activities slowed, the family faced the difficult emotional shift from urgent hope to enduring vigilance. Year after year, they remained committed. They continued to speak publicly. They continued to meet with law enforcement, and they continued to remind the world that behind the headlines was a daughter, a sister, and a life filled with purpose and love. Every anniversary brought renewed attention, renewed questions, and renewed grief. A yearly reminder of the moment everything changed. The community, too, felt the impact deeply. Mason City was not a place accustomed to violent crime, much less to a disappearance that left no clear path forward. Residents who once felt comfortable walking in the pre-dawn hours began to lock their doors more tightly, look over their shoulders more often, and discuss personal safety in ways they never had before. People who had known Jodi, from neighbors to viewers who watched her on television, found themselves grappling with disbelief. It didn't seem possible that someone like her, someone so present in their daily lives, could be gone. Candlelight vigils were held. Community gatherings were organized. Ribbons were tied around trees and lampposts, and signs were displayed across the region. And through it all, people continued searching, not just for answers, but for reassurance, for understanding, for some way to make sense of the loss. Over time, the disappearance shaped conversations about safety, especially for people who worked early morning or late-night shifts. Journalists, broadcasters, and media organizations across the country discussed the vulnerability of those who arrive at studios before sunrise. Jodi's case became a somber example of why awareness matters, why precautions are important, and why personal routines should never be taken lightly. Within the newsroom at KIMT-TV, her absence left a lasting mark. The seat she once filled with energy and warmth became a symbol of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of tragedy. Colleagues who had worked beside her remembered her laughter, her dedication, and her presence during long, early hours. Even years later, those memories remained vivid, reminders of the woman behind the news desk, not just the anchor who greeted viewers at dawn. As time passed, Jodi's story continued to find new platforms, new voices, and new advocates. In 2003, a group of journalists and community members formed FindJodi.com, a volunteer-driven organization dedicated to preserving her legacy and keeping her case alive in the public consciousness. Their website became a comprehensive resource, a place where factual information, case history, and updates could be collected and maintained responsibly. They conducted interviews, published articles, and documented every publicly known detail of the investigation. Their work has served one purpose: ensuring that the world does not forget. FindJodi.com also installed billboards in Mason City, including one placed near the area where Jodi lived and worked. For years, the message stood tall: her name, her photo, her disappearance. A constant reminder that the case was not closed and that answers were still needed. The billboard became part of the landscape, a quiet witness to time passing and a symbol of persistence. Beyond public efforts, Jodi's disappearance also sparked discussions in law enforcement circles. Training programs referenced the case when discussing early morning abductions, time-sensitive investigations, and the importance of a rapid community response. Her case became an example of how critical the first hours are after a disappearance, hours that shape the direction of an investigation for decades to come.
Yet through all of this, one truth remained painfully clear. No matter how many searches were conducted, no matter how many interviews were held, no matter how many theories were examined, the central mystery persisted. The question that defined the case in 1995 continued to define it decades later. What happened to Jodi Huisentruit? Even as time moved forward, her story remained present. Documentaries discussed it, podcasts revisited the timeline, newspapers published anniversary articles, and each recounting brought new listeners, new readers, new people who carried her story with them. Her legacy in journalism also endured. Aspiring reporters learned about her dedication, her work ethic, and her commitment to storytelling. She represented the drive of young journalists who wake before dawn, who prepare meticulously, and who give their energy to the communities they serve. Schools and programs referenced her disappearance when discussing journalist safety, not to instill fear, but to emphasize awareness and preparedness. For her family, the passing years did not lessen the weight of the loss, but they found strength in keeping her memory alive, telling stories about her childhood, her dreams, her accomplishments, and the laughter she brought into their lives. They remembered her as a daughter who called home often, as a sister who uplifted everyone around her, and as a woman who pursued her goals with enthusiasm and heart. Today, more than 2 decades after her disappearance, the case remains open. The search, the questions, and the commitment to finding answers all continue. Investigators still accept tips, people still come forward with information, and the community still holds space for hope. Hope that clarity will one day arrive, and that the truth, long hidden, will finally emerge. But until that moment, the story rests in a place between sorrow and determination, between mystery and memory, between a past frozen in time and a future still seeking answers. What remains is a call, a quiet, powerful call for awareness, for courage, and for persistence. A reminder that missing persons cases do not fade simply because years pass. They remain alive as long as people continue to care, continue to search, and continue to speak the name of the person who was taken from them. And so, this story ends not with closure, but with purpose. A purpose shared by her family, her friends, her community, and everyone who has followed her case over the years. A purpose made clear in a single message, a message that calls out to the world. Even now, share this story. Keep her name alive, because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Jodi Huisentruit, and the truth is never meant to stay silent.